The earliest recorded text writing about the existence of using lenses for optical purposes, in other words, glasses, was in 1268 by Roger Bacon. The first knowledge we have of them being manufactured was in northern Italy about 1290. The first painting showing someone wearing glasses was in 1352. And it was Johannes Kepler, most famously known as an astronomer, who first explained why convex and concave lenses can correct presbyopia and myopia, and that was in 1604. In a similar vein, the earliest known telescope was 1608 by Dutch eyeglass maker Hans Lippershey. Lippershey, can't read my own handwriting. And about that same time, men in the eyeglass making business also invented the first microscope, although who gets credit for that is a bit fuzzy. Talking about these different ways of seeing the world, of course, as a way of getting our minds in the idea of seeing Jesus clearly. I'm someone I've worn glasses since I was in middle school. I remember not being able to see the board anymore where I was sitting, and so they took me to the eye doctor and did the stuff, and finally came back a week or two later and got the glasses and first put them on, and of course they were hideous because they're children's glasses in the 80s. They're big and all of that. But they put them on, and all of a sudden I could actually see something. And I was like, whoa, hey, my eyesight was bad. I had no idea. I'd gotten used to it. Right? You do that. You get used to it after a while and realize that the world is not a fuzzy place. So that was a dawning moment, and I've had them, of course, ever since. And they get stronger as time goes by. Mark chapter 8, Jesus is going to be bringing us to this idea of seeing things clearly. And Mark will do so by putting a miracle in front of the conversation that highlights that theme. So let's look at verse 22. It says, "They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him." Only Mark records this episode. It takes place at Bethsaida, which is on the eastern shore of the Jordan River as it flows into the Sea of Galilee. Mark doesn't tell us whose initiative is represented here. Was this the blind man saying, "I need to go see Jesus, somebody lead me to him"? Or was it the man's family saying, "We heard Jesus was in Bethsaida, come on," and they are pulling him? Maybe they're both involved. Mark doesn't give us that particular thing, but somebody involved in this can see Jesus clearly enough because they know that Jesus can heal. And they have come to Jesus and are begging him to heal this man. It says he took the blind man by the hand, led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asks, "Do you see anything?" Well, our first thought is, why is he leaving the village, right? Why not just do it right where he is? Our first thought, of course, would be that he wanted privacy for this. This is interesting. Only one of 3 times in the Gospel of Mark that a healing is private instead of public. At least it's specifically said to be private. Back in chapter 7, verse 31, we saw the healing of the deaf-mute man. And that was an unusual healing. We saw Jesus, the way he went about it was different than normal, and so is this one. Spitting on the man's eyes, right? A bit unusual. But Mark, once again, doesn't tell us why Jesus goes about doing it this way, so our only thing would be to guess about that. Verse 24, he looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Evidently, this man was not born blind. He must have lost his sight at some point because he knows what people look like and what trees look like. If you'd never seen, you wouldn't know that people looked like trees walking around, right? That's a little too specific. Reminded me of the time at the optometrist where they sit there and do better, worse, or about the same. And you go, worse, I guess, right? Anybody else enjoy the fun of going through all the slides to prove what your eyesight's supposed to be now? So once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. This is the only time, as far as I could see, that Jesus utilizes a second attempt to heal someone. That it doesn't just happen, that we got to go back and do something like a second shot, which you may understand in our current circumstances in the world. Why did he do that? Is he trying to build up this man's faith? Is he trying to teach his disciples something about how God operates? Mark doesn't tell us. But look at the result. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. So as with the deaf-mute man, it was an odd path to get us here, but the expected results that Jesus can heal someone is what we get in the end. And now he sees clearly, reminding us once again of the messianic prophecy of Isaiah 35. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened. And Mark uses this episode to not only get us thinking about vision and seeing, but also to point us back to that idea. And that will be important as we go to the next few verses. Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't even go into the village." Presumably to avoid overly excited crowds that are going to make it difficult for Jesus to do what he wants to do next. He's got a plan for what's coming next, and being mobbed by a crowd is going to get in the way of that. So what is that next thing, and how does it tie in to seeing clearly? Let's look at 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" So it's going to take them a day to walk north along the Jordan River Valley towards Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, Jesus asks them a crucial question. This is really the most crucial question he can ask of his disciples in order to figure out how well they see him, how well they have ascertained who he truly is. And it's going to take spiritual insight, not just ordinary vision, for them to know who Jesus is. So I wonder, what did they have to go on when figuring out who is Jesus? Well, they had prophecies, Isaiah and others that had prophesied. They could think on those. They'd seen many miracles. And of course, they've personally interacted with Jesus many times. But as a teacher, Jesus starts them out on this difficult road of examining who he is by first asking them an easy question. What do other people say that I am? They don't have to think about that, they just report, right? Well, what are other people saying? So he starts them with an easy one. He lobs an easy one at them. And me being me, I couldn't help but think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where the bridge warden asks, "What is your name? What is your favorite color?" Right? And they ask that, and then they get to go across, and then unfortunately one of Arthur's men gets asked, "What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow?" And he says, "I don't know," and he gets tossed into the canyon. If you've never seen it, don't worry about it. If you have, you know what I'm talking about. So the easy question first. They replied. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets. So some people think he's John the Baptist. John was the one who prepared the way, but we know that his time has already passed. John's not alive at this point in the narrative. But some people haven't moved on yet. They're holding on to the past. Some people think he's Elijah. And we know that Elijah is the forerunner, the prototype. But we also know that Malachi prophesied, one of the last prophecies of the Old Testament, that Elijah would return before the end, before the great and terrible day of the Lord. And some people are looking to the future. So we got some people in the past thinking about John the Baptist, some people looking to the future, thinking about Elijah, and thinking, well, maybe Jesus is him. And then you've got other people who are non-committal. They just say, he's one of the prophets. To me, that feels like the least common multiple if you remember your math. That's the easy answer. Hard to go wrong with saying, well, he must be one of the prophets, but that's bland. That's not actually answering anything. That may not be, it's not wrong because Jesus is a prophet, but it's not right either. So the people aren't sure. But they don't know Jesus like the disciples know Jesus. We'll see what difference that makes. 29, here comes the hard question. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? So we're not surprised that the people in general have poor eyesight in this matter. It's because they're not connected to Jesus. But of course, with our theme of corrective lenses, that's the question. Can that eyesight be corrected if you get to know Jesus more, if you spend sufficient time with him, if you are near the light, if you're near the truth, if you listen carefully to it? Can you find the way? It's an important question for us. So let's see how the disciples did, because they represent ordinary folk, do they not? None of them are aristocrats, none of them are rich, none of them are highly educated, they're average people. We're not going to focus this morning on the perennial question of how someone would see Jesus clearly. That's a long debate about election and free will, about predestination, about the role of the Holy Spirit in enlightening and opening hearts and minds. That's an important question, but that's not what we're looking at this morning. We just want to know if it's possible. Not how it happens. Is it possible for the disciples to see Jesus clearly? And if they can see him clearly, then can other people too? You already know where this is going. Peter answered, "You're the Messiah." Your translation might say, "You're the Christ." The NIV used to do that, but they switched it in their new edition to Messiah. It's the same thing, because the Greek word Christ means anointed one. The Hebrew Messiah means anointed one. It's trying to get at the same thing. In a small m sense, in a small m Messiah, there have already been many Messiahs, many anointed ones, because in his time with his covenant people, God has anointed prophets and priests and kings. Many have been anointed. But throughout that period, there was a prophecy about one who would come, one who would surpass all that had gone before. And the book of Hebrews will later explain to us that Jesus is not only prophet, also priest, also king, the ultimate of all three. But there have been many Messiahs before. This is the Messiah. And that is Peter's answer. You're the one we've been waiting for, the one that God promised would come to fulfill his will. Peter sees this clearly. You and I know that he's correct in that assessment, that Jesus is who Jesus claims to be, that Jesus is indeed the Son of God and the Son of Man. His words, his deeds have confirmed it. And that tells us that the light is getting through, that the truth is recognizable. It can be accepted. It's possible, at least for Peter. And nobody amongst the disciples steps up to say, "No, Peter, you're wrong." So we assume they're all on board. The parallel passage in Matthew 16:17 adds the bit of information that God revealed that knowledge to Peter. But we know that God wants humanity to repent and believe, all of humanity. So it's no cause for concern on our part that God needs to be involved in our ability to see Jesus clearly. Because we are, after all, saved by grace. To acknowledge, along with the fact that our salvation is by grace, that our awareness of that grace, that our awareness of the need of that grace is also dependent upon God, that's not a surprise. And that's not a problem, because we were dependent upon God in the first place. So Peter is an example that shows that we can see Jesus clearly with God's help. This is, of course, encouraging news. This would trend toward optimism, not pessimism. Humanity may be living in the darkness, but we can see the light and embrace it. But the text continues. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. And that might be a little bit confusing to some people, because we know that the Gospel of Mark ends with a call to go out into the world and tell everyone about Jesus and proclaim him. We know that Matthew ends the same way. We know that John ends with a personal call. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And we know that Luke wrote a sequel to his gospel called the book of Acts, where he describes missionary activity, the very fact of the church going out into the world to tell everyone. Clearly, the gospel is intended to be shared. This knowledge about Jesus is not meant to be hidden. This is an insight right now, however, that cannot be shared. Spreading who Jesus is at this moment would have interfered with what Jesus still needed to do. By the end of the story, he has already done everything he needs to do, and we can go tell people. The disciples need to hold back on this piece of information because the people's expectations of their Messiah do not match up with God's intentions for what Jesus needs to do next. We know that that's the case because the very next verse is taking us in that direction. Verse 31, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. Notice that Jesus changed right there what he called himself. He didn't say the Messiah must, he said the Son of Man must. And that's interesting. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man more than anything else in the Gospels, 81 times. But nobody else calls him that. Not his disciples, not his critics, nobody else calls him that. He calls himself that. It's an interesting title. It occurs in the Old Testament almost exclusively in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, where it occurs 90 times. Primarily there, it's God talking to Ezekiel, and he refers to Ezekiel as the Son of Man. It's a subtle way for Jesus to change the focus from the Messiah's misguided expectations among the people to what the will of the Father is for Jesus as the Son of Man. Now we know that many, if not most, of the prophets of old dealt with unreceptive audiences. Being called by God to be a prophet was not a career advancement. It was not the path to glory and honor and riches and fame. Because some of them were persecuted, actually probably many. Some were beaten, some were jailed, some were martyred. Why? Seems as if God's going to talk to you, you'd probably want to listen, but the people to whom they were sent, the people of God, the covenant people, did not appreciate the message that God had for them through his prophets. You see, 9 out of 10, and I just made that stat up, 9 out of 10 of the people thought of themselves as more righteous and less wicked than they actually were, and didn't take kindly to being shown the ugly truth by a prophet of God. You can ask yourself the question if that stat's accurate to this day. I would imagine it probably is. That's human nature. We think of ourselves more highly than we ought. Well, will that dynamic change when the Messiah come? If they didn't want to hear it from prophets, would they hear it from the prophet? The people thought so. The people thought when the Messiah comes, of course we'll listen to him. But the consistency of fallen human nature would tell us, not really. And that's exactly what happened. Jesus was loved by many of the common people, but rejected violently by those with power. The powerful saw correctly that Jesus was a threat to them, but failed to accept that the reason for that threat was that they stood in judgment from Almighty God. You see, when Jonah went to Nineveh, the people repented. But they did not when faced with the Son of God. His own people rejected him, as the Gospel of John tells us in the first chapter. And that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Not only would Judaism's leaders oppose Jesus, they would kill him. I don't know if you can get more blind to the truth than that. Jesus also talks here about the resurrection, about the triumph after the bloody defeat. He talks about the dawn after that stormy night. But it's hard for the disciples to focus on that, given how shocking it is to them that Jesus just predicted that he would suffer and die. For them to see this clearly would be remarkable. It would certainly require more of that grace from God that allowed Peter to declare that Jesus is the Messiah. To make a leap this big, an intellectual and emotional leap of this magnitude, is not easy for anyone. History shows us this. Think back to Galileo. Galileo had math to show to the church, to the leaders of the church, observations from the sky, from a telescope, and mathematics to prove that the earth revolved around the sun. Famously, they did not listen to him. The truth that the disciples are being asked to accept is much more bold than that truth that Galileo failed to get an audience to agree to. This proclamation by Jesus that he will suffer and die is mind-blowing to them, and they're confused. Keep in mind, they don't yet understand why. Notice that Jesus said he must suffer many things. But to his disciples, the question is, but why? What would that accomplish? Why would you do such a thing? They're confused. Understandably so. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Once again, Peter takes the lead. We're not surprised by that. A moment ago, it was to agree with Jesus, his great triumph. Now it's to tell him that he's wrong about his own future. I wonder what Peter said. How did he go about doing this? This is an instance of a student telling a teacher, you know what, you're wrong. I look back on high school. I took a class in the Civil War. I had already read a lot of books about the Civil War, and I actually pointed out to my teacher several occasions where he was wrong about something. That's because I was 17 and not too humble at that point. Looking back on it after spending 10 years as a teacher myself, I realize how annoying that must have been. But Peter goes to Jesus and says, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. I don't know if Peter said dude to Jesus. That's just me. Whatever Peter said, he says, I see you more clearly than you see yourself. And there's our question. Who actually can see Jesus clearly? Jesus or Peter? Well, here's our last verse, and that'll tell you the answer. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Notice that he did this in front of the disciples, so they all took notice. Well, it wasn't Peter that saw Jesus more clearly. His vision, to say the least, is impaired. Consider this. Peter went from seeing things from God's point of view when he recognized that Jesus is the Messiah, to now being told he's seeing things from Satan's perspective, the exact opposite. Because he's not able or willing or whatever it is to accept why God had sent his Messiah. Talk about a roller coaster ride for Peter. How did that happen? Let's consider this conversation here where Jesus, or this part of the passage where Jesus says the concerns of God versus merely human concerns. So what is God interested in accomplishing? What is his goal? And how does that differ from these merely human concerns? Human beings tend to focus on the here and now. We can't help it. We live in time. That's our nature. We focus on material concerns because even though we are spiritual beings, the material is what we see. We focus on things like money and power, on governments and kingdoms and careers and the future that for ourselves. But in reality, human beings are only ever reordering the deck chairs on the Titanic. The ship is sinking and everything we're doing is superfluous. God, who as creator does not ignore daily life, he is aware of and concerned with the everyday things. After all, we're told his eye is on the sparrow, and we're told he knows how many hairs you have on your head. But his will and his purpose far transcend those ordinary daily things as well. God's will and purpose are the redemption of humanity, the defeat of sin and death, the reunion of the human race with God once more in fellowship as it was intended in the beginning. See, God sees the big picture and he's working on that. Peter can't see it. What was stopping God from simply making that happen? How come God just didn't, snap his fingers and make that happen? Well, sin and rebellion, of course. God is holy, and his people and people in general are far from it. God will not ignore our sins, nor will he pretend that they didn't happen. You see, they need to be reckoned with. They need to be paid for. And here is where the Messiah fits in. As the Son of God and the Son of Man, Jesus is uniquely capable of paying the price that will free humanity from sin and death. And that's the path that Jesus is headed on, the path that leads to the cross. Peter and the disciples can't see that clearly in the future, but we need to see it clearly in the past. This is the Jesus we worship and proclaim. This is the message of the gospel. Salvation by grace through faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If this is who you see Jesus as, then you're seeing him clearly. Let's apply this text to our lives quickly with three things here. Number one, when Jesus made the blind to see, it was a miracle. When God allows us to see Jesus, we call that amazing grace. Secondly, every true understanding of Jesus sees him as the Messiah and as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, as John the Baptist proclaimed him. And then lastly, we need to then pray that we will proclaim Jesus accurately as he is, and that God's grace, by the grace of God, the lost will see him clearly and believe.